Thanks, Jeremy, and thanks everyone for joining. I'm happy to be able to be part of the group to present our findings of the direct empirical measurement of nitrous oxide and methane emissions from EMISI. Before we get into it, I'd like to acknowledge that a lot of work went into collecting the data for these emissions. Juliet listed a long list of people at the beginning of her talk, and many of those were students around Indonesia who did a lot of the hard work collecting the emissions data. And our colleagues at Universitas Indonesia and the University of New South Wales and Leeds University did a huge amount of work of analyzing the data that we're presenting today. So, although I get to help to be the face of it, please know that there were a huge number of people who put in many hours to produce these results. With that said, I'm going to hand to Akna, who actually was one of the people who was on the ground taking those measurements. So please, Akna.
Thank you, Jeremy. Okay. The EMISI team carried out direct field measurements across 32 on-site and communal systems and also 6 treatment plants, covering a range of sanitation technologies that are typical for Indonesia. So the sampling sizes for each system type were designed under the component 2 of the EMISI project to broadly reflect the national distribution of sanitation technologies. For the on-site system, we intentionally didn't use the term pit latrine or septic tank, as these are often technically inaccurate in the Indonesian context, but instead we developed a more specific technical categorization, which for simplicity is summarized here as prefab containments, in-situ constructed containment, MCK facilities, and small-scale communal systems. For the on-site and communal systems, we measured methane emissions using flux chambers combined with portable gas analyzers. As you can see in the bottom left image on the right-hand side of the slide. As for the centralized wastewater treatment plants, we measured nitrous oxide emissions using dissolved N2O sensors alongside with wastewater quality data sampling, as shown in the top left image. For the fecal sludge treatment plants, nitrous oxide was also measured, but in addition to measuring methane using a larger flux chambers placed over anaerobic and facultative treatment ponds, as shown in the top right image. In addition to continuous measurements, graph sampling was also conducted at appropriate intervals to characterize supporting parameters such as organic and nitrogen load. We did not measure nitrous oxide emissions from on-site systems, as these systems are predominantly anaerobic and were not expected to produce significant N2O emissions under typical operating conditions. Overall, measurements were conducted during both the dry and wet seasons across Jakarta, Bandung, Balikpapan, Manggarai Barat, and Manggarai, allowing us to capture variation in context of climate, urban, and system design. Next slide. Thank you. These are our efforts captured in camera in direct measurements, from measuring unlined and unsealed containment system shown in the top left image to develop several flux chamber designs adjust with Indonesian context. Like for example, the UFO or big flux chamber on the bottom left of the slide for FSTPs. We conducted measurements under the heat of the sun, in the middle of the night, even during the rain, all as part of the collective effort of this amazing project. Next. Yeah, from the household containment units, we observed a median methane emission rate of 2.89 grams CH4 per capita per day, with a geometric mean of 1.78 grams CH4 per capita per day. It is illustrated by the horizontal violet plot on the right-hand side of the slide. However, we also observed variability, with some systems emitting significantly higher methane, reaching up to around 45 grams CH4 per capita per day. Compared with studies from Africa and Nepal, like the SCARE project, these emission rates are relatively lower, but the possible explanation is the higher use of water for cleansing in Indonesian context instead of using toilet paper, which might increase dilution and may result in a greater proportion of methane remaining dissolved rather than being emitted directly. Our system characterization showed that design and operational features, including whether containment walls and bases were lined or sealed, the presence of outlets and aerations do actually influence methane emissions. But our multivariate analysis indicates that no actually single design feature alone explains the variability that we observe. It's actually more that unit-specific condition that may influence more strongly. So the key takeaway is that more nuanced than simply saying that sealed systems emit less methane. Um, but yeah, methane emissions are strongly correlated with sludge accumulation, and it is linked to management practices like regular emptying. So well-constructed, adhering to national standard or what we call SNE compliant containment systems are easier to empty. So including scheduled desludging and delivery of the sludge to functioning fecal sludge treatment plants where emissions can be better controlled. In contrast, poorly constructed or unsealed systems often allow waste and nutrients to migrate to other locations, which shifts emissions to water bodies and drains where they are hard to control rather than eliminating them. Next. So when we compare the communal systems, the Sanimas type, it's pretty common in Indonesia with the household on-site systems. We observed how much lower measured methane emissions from some of these Sanimas systems. But this lower emission rate does not necessarily indicate better performance. In several cases, what was actually happening was short circuiting or bypassing of the treatment units, meaning that the fecal waste was not being retained within the anaerobic baffled reactors or ABR. And as a result, the methane was not emitted within the ABR itself, but displaced to other parts of the environment. In contrast, the MCK facilities that were measured showed very high methane emissions, largely because these systems were overloaded with substantial sludge accumulation. The key takeaway is that system functionality strongly influence measured emission rates. Poor operation and maintenance can cause short circuiting, like pipe being clogged and everything, which shift emissions to unmanaged locations, while also increasing the discharge of untreated or partially treated wastewater to the environment, like Juliet said earlier. As illustrated in the diagram on the right-hand side, when a system is properly functioning, wastewater flows through the full intended treatment train. However, when there is clogging or blockage within pipes or chambers, wastewater can overflow or bypass treatment units altogether, and in some cases can be discharged directly to the outlet. Next slide, please.
I'll pick up from here. Thanks very much, Akna. So in contrast to the results that Akna just presented, centralized wastewater treatment plants have been measured globally in many different countries. There's been many studies of N2O emissions from wastewater treatment plants, whereas there's very little on on-site household containment units and communal systems. However, what distinguishes the EMISI dataset is those measurements typically are in high-income countries and in countries with temperate climates. And we can expect that wastewater characteristics are different in Indonesia compared to high-income country contexts. There's a tropical climate, and the wastewater treatment facilities are not always operating as intended, and these can all influence emission rates. That said, we calculated nitrous oxide emission factors for four plants. Krukut in Jakarta, Unjung Menteng was a small packaged wastewater treatment plant within an apartment building in Jakarta. And Margasari is in Balikpapan, and then the Labuan Bajo wastewater treatment plant. So the Krukut and the Unjung Menteng wastewater treatment plants had emission factors that are comparable to what we see in high-income countries, whereas the wastewater treatment plants in Margasari and then Labuan Bajo had much higher emission factors. When you compare conventional activated sludge processes globally, which are what are used in Unjung Menteng and Labuan Bajo, they typically have an emissions factor of 0.76%, which is similar to Ujung Menteng, but you can see Labuan Bajo is much higher than that. And oxidation ditches, which is similar to the process used in Margasari, typically have an emissions factor of 0.44%, and you can see Margasari's emissions factor was much higher than that. There's a number of reasons why the emission factors vary quite widely. A lot of it has to do with how the systems are operated and how they were designed. Um, Outside of Krukut, which is a big plant in Jakarta that is relatively well operated, The other wastewater treatment plants were confronted with issues like broken blowers or electricity outages that affected the operation of the plants. And it's possible that that these issues made it difficult for them to control the process, the treatment processes, which may have had an effect on the nitrous oxide emissions. There was also limited monitoring of wastewater parameters at some of these plants, which made it difficult to characterize emissions, particularly in the case of Margasari. Interestingly, there are very few studies on nitrous oxide emissions from MBBRs, which is the process used in Kruku globally. So this is filling a significant evidence gap with that particular type of technology. Next slide, please. Yes. Fecal sludge treatment plants are, in comparison, very, very understudied. EMISI included two, the Pulau Gebang fecal sludge treatment plant in Jakarta and the treatment plant in Manggar and Balikpapan. You can see that the emission rates varied significantly across these plants as well. Pulau Gebang having an emissions rate of approximately 23 to 27 kilograms of methane per day compared to Manggar, which only had 1 to 2.7. There are reasons for why these might be different. Pulau Gebang, again, there was issues with operational issues. These measurements in Pulau Gebang were taken from I believe, a facultative pond, and the previous aeration pond had problems with its aerators, so a large amount of organic loads were going into the pond. You might notice that these are being reported in kilograms of methane per day instead of per capita. One of the challenges in calculating a per capita emissions rate is the population equivalence, or the number of people that are using the fecal sludge treatment plant. It's very difficult to calculate how many people's waste are going into a fecal sludge treatment plant because emptiers take waste from many different places. So this is something that we'll continue to work on in order to determine a per capita rate that would allow us to compare across systems. Nitrous oxide emissions were very low. We measured dissolved nitrous oxide in some of the ponds in both of the sites. And it wasn't surprising because Pulau Gebang, as we mentioned, some of the aerators were not functioning. And in Manggar, there was no active aeration. It was just passively aerated ponds. Hence, you don't get much N2O production. Overall, fecal sludge treatment plants are very understudied globally, so it's difficult to make comparisons outside of Indonesia. But as we'll talk about later in the presentation, fecal sludge treatment plants are a critical point for managing emissions, as we'll need to continue to move emissions away from on-site systems and put them in places where we can manage them. So further research and monitoring emissions from fecal sludge treatment plants will be especially important.